Okay, now let's get into tables. Advanced tables. And since we are calling this section advanced tables, let's call this advanced lists. Okay, under advanced tables, let's start by creating a table tag. Just a fair warning, this lesson on advanced tables is going to get pretty advanced. What we're going to be doing is we're going to be creating a printable Sudoku puzzle. For those of you who don't know what a Sudoku puzzle is, this is what it looks like. I generated this using OpenSky.ca, and it's basically a table of a bunch of numbers with some kind of a separator in between every 3 rows and every 3 columns. The goal is to have each of these squares have a number from 1 through 9 once each, have each row have a number from 1 through 9 once each, and also each column have a number from 1 through 9. We're not going to be solving this puzzle. We're just going to be implementing it step by step using tables in HTML with some very, very minimal styling. So we're going to be using pure HTML and just very, very tiny amounts of styling. Similar to how we styled our unordered list up here, very small amounts of style here and there. So let's get started. First of all, if we're generating a table with a Sudoku puzzle, you probably want to provide some type of direction to our readers on what this table is about. And within a table, you can actually define a special tag called a caption, which does exactly that. Inside a caption, let's use an H4 for some small text and say Sudoku puzzle. We haven't defined our table yet completely, so for now we'll just say Sudoku puzzle as our caption. And we're going to add some more directions later on. Now, let's go into defining our table. Note that it's got 9 rows. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. It's got 9 rows, and it has 9 columns. However, there is a little bit of a separator after every 3rd row, and there's also a little bit of a separator after every 3rd column. So let's start by creating our first row. Let's take it one step at a time. TR for row, and then TD for a column. And in the first column, we have a 3. In the second column, we have a 9. In the third column, we have an 8. So let's see how that looks. We have 3, 9, and 8. Notice, though, there are some slightly better separators in between the 3, 9, and 8. With our Sudoku puzzle, and we can add this to our table by going up to the table tag and right afterwards adding a border property. Border equals string, so double quotes, and let's just give it a border of 1 for now. Actually, let's make it a little bit darker. Let's give it a border of 2. Now we go back down to our row, and now here's where the separator comes in. So instead of a separator, for now I'm just going to create another TD, an empty column. This is separation enough to let our readers know that the 3, 9, and 8 are sort of belong to their own little world, and then now there's an empty column as a separator. So now let's go in to the next column, and we have 6 empty spaces. So in order to do an empty space in HTML, remember, just doing a space won't work because HTML is space insensitive. So when you see that it doesn't work, enter a special character for non-breaking space. So I'm just going to copy this and repeat 2 more times. Then I'm going to add an empty column again, and then I'm going to paste this 3 more times again. But notice that the spacing here between each TD, inside of each TD, maybe 1 non-breaking space won't be enough. Maybe we should add 2 non-breaking spaces instead to make the columns a little bit wider. To do that, inside of brackets, I'm going to press Command and click in front of all 6 non-breaking spaces. If you have a Windows computer, use Control and click, and then I'm going to do a little bit of a keyboard shortcut. I'm going to hold Alt, I'm going to press Shift, and then I'm going to press the right arrow to highlight the entire word, and then I'm going to press Command C or Control C if you're on Windows to copy, and then I'm going to press Command V or paste. Now that copied over a non-breaking space after each of these non-breaking spaces. Wasn't that much faster? This is how productive you can be when you know all the keyboard shortcuts. Not even all of them, just the essential ones. Okay, so there we have our first row. Again, we're not gonna focus too much on styling just yet, but I do want to point out that, after adding this first row, the puzzle seems a little bit empty. I'll actually probably want to add, similar to how they have here, puzzle 1 difficulty rating 0.34. We don't need to add the difficulty rating, but let's at least add a difficulty as a header. So in order to add a header to a table, there is an interesting tag that we covered before called a t-head. Now the interesting thing about the t-head is that we can define a separate tr tag inside of the t-head. The difference though is that instead of a td being a data element, this time this is part of the header of the table. So instead of a td, we're going to do th and specify difficulty. And then I'm gonna add another td. Oops, this should be a th. Remember, it's not td, it's th. So I'm gonna do the same thing I did before. Select 4 at once, 4 cursors, delete, and th. Okay, so now inside the second th tag I created, I'm gonna write easy. But note that that kind of messed up our spacing here, right? That messed up our spacing a little bit. So in order to give this slightly better spacing inside of the table, all data properties also have this property, and then the ths also have this property. And this property is going to give us a little bit better spacing with our th tag. So I'm going to give it a property call span. I'm going to set that equal to, let's just say 5 and see how that looks. Okay, not bad. Now I'm going to add a call span property to the easy header, and I'm going to give it the call span equals, let's try 3. Okay, so I don't know if you can see this too clearly, but note that these 3 cells on the right here that don't have a th are slightly thinner than these 3 cells here that do have a th. So let's make our call span a little bit wider. Notice that when we gave it a call span of 5, the word difficulty now extends 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 columns as defined by our row underneath it. So instead of 5 columns, let's try having it extend 6 columns. And similarly, instead of easy extending 3 columns, let's have it extend 4 columns. Now the spacing is much more even. Okay, so let's continue with our next row. So with our second row, we're going to create a td, and we have 2 empty spaces and then a 2. So again, for an empty space, we're going to add the non-breaking space tag here. Copy this over. Next, I'll create another td with the value 2. Now we're at the border, right? So now I'll create an empty td, not give it a value of anything, and then I'll create a td with 2 empty spaces. The next td we'll have is 8. Another td with 2 empty spaces, and now this will be an empty td. And now we have the numbers 3, 5, and 9. So td with 3, td 5, and td 9. So let's save this and check out how it looks. Not bad. However, these borders around the empty tds do make it a little bit distracting, right? So let's take care of that. We're going to go to our empty tds. I'm going to select all of the empty tds, Command click to show multiple cursors, and let's add a little bit of styling to our empty tds. So style equals double quotes border, none. And as soon as I do that, those empty TDs disappear. So now instead of adding just a regular empty TD, we're going to add an empty TD with the style border equal to none. And while we're at it, why don't we just remove the border from our th tags too? Th style equals double quotes border none. Okay, there. Much better. Now let's continue. So let's create our third row, and inside this third row, we're going to add 3 empty space cells, 3 cells with 2 spaces, and then an empty TD with the style border none. So now we're at the 1. So now we're going to add 1 and then 2 more cells with 2 empty spaces, TD 1, and then TD with 2 non-breaking spaces. And now we'll add an empty TD with the style border none. Now let's add a 4 and then 2 more cells with 2 spaces. So TD 4 and then 2 more cells with 2 spaces. Okay, so we have the puzzle mostly planned out. Now we will add an empty row as our border. And note that when we add an empty row, it creates just a subtle bit of spacing down here that we won't really get to see until we create a row underneath it. So here's our empty row, and then here's the row underneath it where we will add some elements inside. So inside our empty row, we'll add a cell with 2 spaces, and then a 4, and then a 9. So 4, oops, this should be 2 spaces, and then a 4, and then a 9. You know, now that I'm looking at this table and comparing it to the actual Sudoku puzzle, maybe we should add a little bit more horizontal spacing to make the table cells seem a little bit more square. So let's go back to our table heading here, and let's change this back to 5, change this to 3. So there's a little bit more horizontal spacing. And now let's go to our empty cells here, starts at this TD, and let's add 1 more non-breaking space on each cell. Just by doing that, it already expanded the width of all of our table cells. So let's continue. All the way at the bottom here, after the non-breaking space 4, 9. Now we add an empty TD with the style border equals none, and then we continue with a space cell, a 1, another space cell. So let's add a space cell, another TD with 1, and a 3rd space cell, and now a border cell, and then 3 space cells. Let's see where else we've done 3 space cells. Up here. So copy and paste those. That's our 4th row. Now for the 5th row, we're going to start going pretty fast now. TD 8, 2 space cells, a 6, 9, and 5 after a border cell. So border cell, and then a 6, a 9, a 5, and then another border cell. We're right here now. And then 2 empty cells, or 2 space cells. I'll call all the white space cells, and then I'll call the border cells, and then a 4. Just make sure this looks okay. Yep, so far so good. Let's add a little bit more spacing after each row here. So let's find our empty row and add another empty row underneath it. Okay, so now we're on the 6th row. We're almost 2/3 of the way there. So let's exit our current row, create a new row. This is great practice for building tables, by the way, because tables can be really complicated, but after you finish the Sudoku puzzle, you'll be table masters and mistresses. Okay, then we have 3 empty cells and a border cell, or 3 space cells and then a border cell. So let's find where we've done 3 space cells before. 3 space cells, and then a border cell, and then another space cell, 4, and then a third space cell. So I'm going to copy a space cell, paste, TD4, and a third space cell. Okay, finally we have 5, 9, and then a space cell. So here's 5, 9, and then a space cell. Now let's create 2 more empty rows for this second border here, second horizontal border, and then 2 empty cells, or 2 space cells into 5. So let's copy a space cell. And remember, this is going to be inside third row tag. That won't be empty. 2 more space cells, and then a 5. So this is what we've got so far. Oh, I missed a border cell somewhere. Okay, so let's go to where this 5 is, and that should be a border cell that I missed. So I'm going to copy this and then paste it here so that it becomes a border cell. Let's just make sure it looks the same. 5, 9 empty space. Yep. Okay, now we're on row 7, and now we're on the border cell. Then we have 2 space cells, and then a 3. So let's do 2 space cells, and then a 3, and then a border cell, and then 3 empty cells. So we have border cell, and then 3 empty cells. Okay, just 2 more rows, then we'll have a Sudoku puzzle. 7, 8, 6. So let's create another row. TD7, TD8, TD6, and then let's create a border cell, and then a space cell, a 2, and another space cell. So space cell, a 2, and another space cell, and then a border cell. Okay, we have a border cell, and then a 1 and a 2 space cells. TD1, and then 2 space cells. Okay, last row. Alright, TR, a space cell, and a third space cell, and then a border cell, then 3 space cells, and then a 7, 8, and 2. But there's a border before that. So a border cell, then a TD with 7, TD with 8, and a TD with 2. There we go. There's our Sudoku puzzle. This is probably the most advanced table you'll have created in any HTML course. So now let's add a little bit of a description to our Sudoku puzzle inside the caption tag. So inside caption H4, let's create another paragraph tag and say directions have each 3 by 3 square, each row and each column have a number from 1 through 9. No repeat numbers allowed per row, column, or 3 by 3 square. Those are our directions. And then let's add an emphasis on the word directions. So interesting note, while we're on the topic of emphasis, one of the other features that was removed, or I should say changed in HTML5, is that the U tag should not be used for just plain underlining anymore. It actually went from a plain stylistic tag to the equivalent of an EM tag, meaning the U tag is for elements that should be styled differently from the surrounding text. Like, for example, proper nouns in Chinese should use the U tag, or elements that are stylistically different with an extra emphasis. So the U went from the equivalent of an I tag to the equivalent of an EM tag after HTML5. Very subtle difference, but the developers of HTML5 now recommend using CSS for underlining. Just a little bit of an aside. So there we have it, a Sudoku puzzle created entirely using tables.